There we go. So now this is a slide deck that is kind of a back and forth between you and the district, but this is going to take you through some of the tools that you have access to when reviewing applications. So we talked a little bit about the history log. There's some things you guys can do. There's a MDOE history log. We talked about the checklist. We'll get into that a little more. There's a change log, revision details, some search capabilities, email, and then we'll talk about reports. In the history log, MDOE users had the ability to mark an item as attention needed. So this is kind of a way to draw attention to an ongoing like discussion, perhaps. So like right here, Travis created a comment saying, hey, reminder that we asked you to submit outstanding documentation from an audit. And by checking that box, it promotes that item to the top of the history log. The history log by default displays the newest items at the top. But if you want to kind of like take something that's sort of ongoing that you don't want to kind of fall off the radar, you can check that box and it'll put it at the top. And then even as they create revisions, typically the items in the history log stay with the revision that they apply to. But as they create revisions, an item that's attention needed will travel with that revision. So if this is something you're keeping your eye on, this is always going to show up at the top of that history log. And then, once they address the issue, you should uncheck that and it will fall back down into kind of wherever it lives in the general history log timeline. And then you guys, you have your own history log that the districts can't see or don't have access to. So if you kind of want to, if you just want to kind of keep notes about a district or concerns you have in reviewing their application that aren't necessarily intended to be published to them, you have this MDOE history log. Or if you have multiple consultants there at the agency working on a district's application or reviewing it, you can have back and forth discussions in there that the district can't see. So you have just the regular history log that is kind of back and forth between you and the district, but then you also have the MDOE history log, which is specific to the agency. The district doesn't see that link. The district doesn't see what's in that history log. So you can just kind of keep your own, running notes about the district or internal conversations about that district's application. We talked about the consultant checklist. This goes above and beyond the system validations to try to identify qualitative issues with a submitted application. So again, we validate that they budget too much. Did they answer all the questions? But we can't validate if they put in a good answer. So the checklist is a way for you to kind of point out to a district, hey, here's the issues we've identified with your application. Please fix these and resubmit them. What actually happened when we created this checklist, the idea of the checklist was for, communicating issues back to the district so they could fix things. But the way we found that it ended up being used is the districts can see the empty checklist because you fill out the checklist as you're reviewing their application. The district can see the checklist, like the framework of it and what's in it. They can see it when they're working on their application. So what that means is it sort of gives them some insight into, hey, these are the things that MDOE is going to be scrutinizing about my application. So I want to make sure that I, do these thoroughly and I do these well so that they don't send it back to me. So its intent was to, kind of streamline your ability to communicate issues back to them. But we actually even found that it kind of helps them understand, hey, these are the criteria they're going to be looking at. Let's make sure we hit these. And ideally, they submit kind of a better application from the start by knowing what's in that checklist and the things that Maine's going to be focused on. And so the items in the checklist, so you use the checklist as a basis for reviewing your submitted application. So a checklist is made up of any number of sections. And you basically review each section. You say, okay, this section is approved, which means I'm good with it. By default, it's not reviewed. So when you just go into the checklist for the first time, everything's going to be not reviewed. You can mark a section as not applicable if it just doesn't apply to that district, or you can mark it, I think it's called attention needed. In this case, in the screenshot, it's calling it not approved. I believe in your system, it's called attention needed. But basically, when you send it back to the district, they come to this checklist and they look for items that are attention needed, and that spells out to them, these are the items that I need to fix. So again, we say mark the items as attention needed. I need to update that screenshot on the previous slide because it was using an old one. And then check the boxes next to the item that require modification. So we have these boxes here these are sort of like the predefined items, like, hey, here's where we found issues. But then we also just have a text box. If none of the items you want to call out are identified in this list, you can just kind of type it in there. Now, what you will find over time is if you're continually typing the same thing down here for a number of districts, it means two things. It means, first of all, we probably should add it as a kind of like a standard item, so you can just check the box and not have to type every time you want to call that out to a district. But if you're typing this all the time, or if you're checking a particular box all the time, it might be an indication that this is an item you need to focus on with districts when you're having your correspondences and training sessions with them, of like, hey, we're seeing a lot of issues in this area, and making sure they understand what you're going for in that area, so that you're not having to constantly call those items out to them. So once you've filled out the checklist with any items, now it could be that everything is fine and you mark everything okay and then you just approve it. But if you find issues with it, if you mark items attention needed, once you're finished reviewing it, you then return the application to the district, and they come into the checklist and find the items that need attention, and they fix those. So then there is also this change log. This is on the sections page. It's under the link to the MDOE History Log. And this allows you to view changes that have occurred to an application from a specific point in time. And so this is particularly useful in conjunction with that checklist. If you send the application back to the district and you say, hey, change these two things, and they resubmit it to you, you don't want to have to re-review the entire application to see everything that they change, right? You want to see that they change the two things that you asked them to, but you also want to be able to see, did they change anything else that I didn't ask them to? But you don't want to have to review the entire application again. So what you can do is, if you view this change log, you can see, hey, what's everything that's changed from a specific milestone? And in this case, you're presented that the milestones are the status changes. So what you want to do when a district resubmits an application to you after fixing their checklist stuff is, if you go to this change log, the options in that dropdown are the status changes. So you would say, show me everything that's changed since I sent it back to them, return not approved. So in this case, the MDOE ESEA Consolidated Regional Program Manager returned it not approved on May 2nd at 1:58 p.m. So this is saying, show me everything that's changed since I sent it back to them. So you can tell when they resubmit to you, did they change the stuff I asked them to change, but also did they change anything else that I didn't ask them to change? Maybe you thought that, you know, their Title IIA narratives were fine and you didn't ask them to change them, but they did. So then you would know to go and review those items as well. So ideally, they're not changing things you don't ask them to, but if they did, this change log calls that out so you know what to look at. So that's the change log. The change log shows you incremental changes within a revision. So if they change something, if there's a checkbox and they check the box and they save it, and then they uncheck it and save it, and then they check it and save it and uncheck it and save it, that's going to be in that change log 4 times for each time they've done the thing and saved it. It's every incremental change that they've made. There's also this concept of revision details, which basically shows you the net difference between a current revision and the previous revision. So revision details, you use that, you know, to compare the current revision to the most recently approved application. So it will show you, so after you've approved the application, they may say, I need to make changes to my application. So they create a revision, they make their changes, and they submit to you. Now, again, you don't want to review the entire application. You just want to see, what are the net differences between this thing they're submitting to me now and the application that I approved 3 months ago. So the revision details will show you on that sections page, hey, here's the sections or pages that changed. And if I click into those links, it'll show me everything that changed. So you don't have to review the entire application. You can just review the items that they've changed, because you already approved all the other stuff that they didn't change. So this is kind of a nice tool. Once you have an approved application, hopefully their changes are minor and you can review those pretty quickly, but you don't have to go compare this application to the previous on a page-by-page basis to know what's different. And the revision details works kind of like the validation. You know, you can view revision details for the entire application, or just a section, or just a page. It will kind of tell you what changed, and it will give you a link that you can click to go to the page where that change occurred if you want to review that page again. You have some search screens available to you. One of these is search funding applications. You can search by fiscal year. You can search for your particular funding app. You can search for districts by status. For example, if you want to see all the districts that haven't yet submitted an application to you, you can search by a combination of all these application statuses to say, hey, these are districts that aren't submitting the stuff I need them to submit. And it displays the results. You can click into any of those districts' applications. And what you can also do from these search screens is you can send bulk emails. And so what this allows you to do is, an example here is you might get 2 months into the application cycle and you got some districts that have allocations that are sitting in a status of not started. Well, you got 50 districts whose applications are not started, and you don't want to have to notify each of those 50 districts individually. So you could simply search for those applications that are in a status of not started. In this case, I have 169 applications because nobody started the application yet. And I can say bulk email, and I can fill in a subject and a message content, and I can say, send this to all the LEA fiscal reps and all the LEA authorized reps. And then basically the users with those roles in the districts that came back in the search would get the email. So it's a good way to kind of hit a large group of people with a targeted message all at once. And so that bulk email is a nice tool that's available to you through those search screens. Email inbox, any of the emails that you send or receive through the system will show up here in the email inbox that you can click into and look at those. And then we have a reports module on the left-hand navigation. This is for MDOE staff, and you can run a number of predefined reports. They allow you to download index cell for further filtering or manipulation. We've got some standard reports that are out there, but we can work with you to define additional reports that you want and set those up as well. So let me go back into our demo. So we finished in the history log. The LEA authorized rep had approved the application. So now this application is in MDOE's hands. And they would begin their review of it. The first thing we talked about was the history log, attention needed. So we asked if you could use grant funds to pay for substitute teachers, and this was many comments and status changes ago. But if I mark that attention needed, and come back here, then this one moves to the top, and this will stay at the top. So if it's kind of a critical issue that you want to kind of keep your eye on, you can mark those attention needed, and they rise to the top, and you can see they're checked. And when you fixed it, you can uncheck it. And there is a report that you can run that shows you all of your attention needed across all of the different funding applications and districts. So you don't have to kind of go into a district's application to see if they have attention needed stuff. But so I will uncheck that. And that's only you can do that. The districts can't mark items as attention needed. But that's a tool specifically to you. We have here's the MDOE history log. It shows you all the status changes. I can create a comment, say, and this is, you could email it to colleagues at the MDOE, or you just put it in there kind of as your ongoing notes as you're reviewing the application. And the district can't see that. That's the MDOE history log. So then let's go to the checklist. And so this checklist is set up in whatever way kind of makes sense for that funding app. As you see, I mean, checklists can get pretty long. The CT application has a number of pages, and so the checklist is set up to kind of follow those pages. So there's quite a few items in here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to manually mark. I'm just going to quickly mark most of these okay. And again, you know, these are the items that are set up, but I think the checklist is kind of a living document. And I think particularly after the first year, I think you'll have an idea of like, hey, what's in the checklist that doesn't need to be in the checklist, and what needs to be in the checklist that isn't in the checklist. And And so I think after year one, you probably like have a good bit of changes you want to make to the checklist for the next year. But it's every year you would want to do that. I'm actually going to mark this one attention needed. And I'm going to say that how your approved programs are aligned in demand. So I'm going to check this box. If you remember, I had that response that says we don't do that. We just offer programs that are in areas we know about. So as the CT reviewer, I would check this box and say, hey, this one requires attention. And then I'm going to go ahead and mark these other ones okay, quick as I can. But you would kind of go through these a little more diligently than I am. So basically, I'm the state. I've done my review. Most of the stuff you've submitted looks good, but I've got this issue here that I want them to fix. So I'm going to go back to the sections page, and I'm going to return this to the district. I want them to fix these items. So I'm going to return it not approved. And so this sends it back to the district and it opens it up so they can make those changes. So as the district now, when the state sends it back to me like this, I go to the checklist and say, all right, what do they get? What do they have for me? What are the issues? And I can scroll through here and say, okay, all these guys look good. Oh, wait, approved instructional programs. How your approved programs are aligned with in-demand industry sectors. So I'm going to go to that page. I think that was here. And I say, we don't do this. We just offer programs we're knowledgeable about. And that's not an acceptable answer. So we figure out, oh, you know what? We need to, we have a process recognizing tailoring offerings to those fields. Whatever that is, they rectify the situation. They correct that issue. But while I have it back, you know what? I want to go make a change to my budget. While the application's open to me, I need to do some more budgeting. So I'm going to go, I have $5,000 that I didn't budget. So I'm going to add a budget line for that $5,000. To make sure my nonsense response is spelled correctly. I have to apply budget tags to that because that's required for the CT secondary grant. And so I've added $5,000 to my budget. So I fixed the thing I was asked to fix on the approved instructional programs page. I also try to sneak in another change. And now I want to move this to draft edits completed, which, as we said, basically sends it back to the SEA. Because the treasurer and superintendent already signed off, they don't have to sign off again. So it's going to run validation. I don't have any errors. I'm going to move it to draft edits completed. And again, I have to agree to that confirmation. So now, it comes back to you at the state, MDOE CT secondary consultant. So that user would have gotten an email saying, hey, Auburn Public Schools CT secondary application was moved to draft edits completed. So now they know, hey, I need to go review this application. Well, they're going to come in and say, oh, what did I do? What did I ask them to change? So they're going to go to the checklist. And they're going to see, okay, what were the issues I identified with this application? Because maybe you sent it back to them and they took 2 weeks and you've forgotten what it is you asked them to change. Okay, so you're going to scroll through here. You're going to find all the attention needed items. You're going to say, oh yeah, they didn't have any way of identifying in-demand industry sectors. So let me go see if they fixed that. So let me go to that page. They have a process for recognizing fields in demand and tailoring our, okay. So whatever their response there is, I'm satisfied with that. But again, I don't know, did they change anything else? They fixed this thing I asked them to fix, but what else did they do? So let me take a look at the change log before I approve it, because maybe there's other stuff I need to look at. So change log allows you to review all the changes that have occurred within this application or revision. So basically, I'm going to come in here and say, when I moved it to this return not approved status, it reopened the application to them. So I want to see everything that's changed since then. Now, if I said, show me everything that's changed since not started, it would show you every single thing the district had done in the application. But you've already reviewed all those things when you were at this point. Now you just want to make sure that you know everything they've changed since you sent it back to them. So you could look at everything, but in this case, you don't want to look at everything because everything up through here you already looked at. You want to see everything they changed since this point in time. And so this is going to go back and it's going to look through everything and it's going to say, all right, what did they change? So we've got 4 items here. They made this change, which was the item we asked them to change, which was the item that we reviewed. But then they also inserted this budget item of $5,000 for school administration salaries that contained these 2 budget tags. So we can easily see, yeah, you fixed the stuff I asked you to fix, but you also did some other stuff. So you might say, well, this isn't okay, and then send it back to them for that, in which case you would mark that in the checklist. Or you might say, you know what, they made this change, but I'm okay with it. But it's calling out that they did make this change, and then you need to assess, whether that change is approvable or not. So I'm going to go back to the sections page. I need to go to the checklist and say, you know what, I'm okay with the change they made. Now it could be that you still have an issue with it, in which case you leave it attention needed. Maybe you give them a little more background on what specifically you're looking for if you didn't like their first change, but I'll change this to okay. I'm happy with the change they put in. I'll go back to the sections page. And now that everything in their checklist is marked okay, I can say, let's go ahead and approve this. And as we said, the career tech, they have 2 levels of approval, the consultant and a director. So now the director is notified that they need to review it. They would perform a review of whatever aspects of it they want to review. We're going to say, let's approve this. And so now this is an approved application. This can no longer be changed. If they want to change the application, they would need to start a revision to it, which makes a copy that becomes editable. But this version is forever preserved in time as it was approved by the state. And so a couple things happen. We talked about this is public, like a user could come in off the streets, not signed in, and look at this application now. But they have approved budgets, so they can start requesting payment of their grant funds through the invoicing section, which we'll get into in a minute. Before we do that, I want to show you a few things about the revision. So right now, this is Auburn. It's their FY22 CT secondary application, and this is revision 0, which means it's the approved application. So I'm going to start a revision. Let's do that. And so we're going to go back to the sections page, and our application is now in a status of revision started, and I can move it to revision completed once I'm done updating it. You see now, though, we have Rev 1. All right, revision 0 is still out there. If I come over here to funding applications, right now I'm looking at all active. So these are the applications that are basically the current versions of my applications. But if I change this drop down to all approved, there's my CT secondary revision 0 that was already approved. And I can click into this and I can go look at it. You see there's no next status. I can't change the status on this. This one is forever preserved. Revision 1 is the active one now. This is my revision 0. So even if I change revision 1 drastically, revision 0 will always be out there in the state that it was in when it was approved. And then the changes would be applied to revision 1 or revision 2 or 3, depending on how many of those I do over the course of the year. So I'm going to go back out. I'm going to go into my revision by changing this to active, which shows me revision 1. When I click in there, so maybe, there's a number of things I might do. I'm going to do something pretty basic here. I want to go back to these assurances, and this is just an example. They probably wouldn't ever uncheck the assurances. But those assurances we checked at the end of one of the previous demos, I'm going to uncheck these. I don't agree to these assurances anymore. So they couldn't submit it to you this way because they're required. But what I want to point out is this revision details column out here. So you can see I have details on this all row. I have no details. I have no revision details on any of these pages because nothing changed. But I do have them on a couple of these pages. So what I can say is whatever they submit to you in the revision, and the district can see this as well. So when the district's reviewing it, they can tell. But if I click revision details here, it's going to show me everything that changed in this application. In this case, basically saying this item is no longer selected, this item is no longer selected. So you don't have to review their entire application from top to bottom when they send that back to you. You can just look at the revision details and say, okay, everything that I approved is the way it was, except for these two things. And then you just have to assess, are you okay with these two things or not? So that's kind of a nice way to you just kind of incrementally assess, you know, the changes they made versus trying to assess the whole thing or trying to figure out what they changed. So I'll show you the search funding applications. That's over here on the left navigation. So I can search for, as we talked about, you know, maybe you get a couple months into the cycle and you want to say, you know, what are the districts that haven't really done any work yet? So I searched for 2022 CT secondary applications that are not started, which basically means that they haven't done anything. So I have 176 districts in there. And so I can come in here and say, you know what, I need to notify these districts. So I want to send it to the LEA authorized representative, the secondary director, and the fiscal rep. I can say add those. Then I can also say, you know what, I want to send it to Chris because I want him to be involved. So you can pick by roles and stuff, but if you have somebody that maybe doesn't show up in some of those options, you can just type in an address. And I can say, please submit your 2022 CT secondary application by July 1. Say, please submit your application whatever that is, okay? And then that sends to the 176 districts, it sends it to their authorized rep, fiscal rep, and CT secondary application director. Now, obviously, there's not very many of those right now because we haven't set up the users. So really just Terry Smith is the only user that's going to get this because their applications have not started and they have that role. So it is important to have the users in the system. But like once you are in the system and you kind of the districts are established with their users, this would have, you know, hundreds of users in it that this would go to all at once. So in this case, it sent it to Terry Smith and it sent it to me. But again, if you had all those users, it would have sent it to all of them at once. Okay, reports over here on the left navigation. There's a number of items out here. I'm going to look at this allocations by type report, and this just allows me to see. Here we go. I want to look at fiscal year 2022. I want to look at my CT secondary funding app, and there's only one grant in there, so I can run this report, and it will basically show me everybody. Every district that I've given allocation to, the amount they've received. I ran kind of like a mass script that just gave everybody $100,000. So that's probably not what you would see in reality. And then what I can do is I can download this to Excel or some other format. And that brings up it's gonna be this guy that I already opened. So I've taken this report and I've done some filtering. So I just said, I only want to see the A districts, but all the stuff you can do in Excel, then you can do with this and manipulate or summarize or do whatever you want with it. But we've got a number of reports, you know, set up initially. And if there's other reports that you need, we can work with you on getting those out there as well.